we're going to examine the end of World War I, kind of the last days of the war, and then the resulting Treaty of Versailles, which kind of ends the war after the armistice to bring about massive changes that will impact the rest of the world for the next 30 years until World War II kind of shatters it all. But the lasting legacies of World War I kind of exist to this day. So this war ends, and the last few days are kind of this time of trial and tribulation because, if you recall, the Russians sign a separate peace treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, with the Germans, and so Germany no longer has an eastern front that they have to maintain a number of soldiers on. And so this opens up it really frees up their army. So they shift everyone to the west. And in late 1918, they manage this last-ditch effort to launch all of their soldiers against the west. And they actually end up pushing to within 35 miles of Paris, but it is there that they are defeated at the Second Battle of the Marne. So it's in nearly it's along the same river, but it's kind of near the First Battle of the Marne, which you recall saved France at the beginning of the war. And this second battle really is kind of the last crushing defeat for the Germans. And they're defeated there because of the combined strength of the French and British forces. But there's also about 150,000 new American soldiers there. And because these new soldiers are there, it's kind of this resupply, fresh troops who are not as jaded or disgruntled from the war. And so this kind of indicates that the Americans would be able to keep pushing more soldiers and tip the balance of power. And so at this point, the writing was on the wall. The Germans were going to lose. And so on November 11th of 1918, Germany signs an armistice, which is a ceasefire. And that's why we know it as Armistice Day or Veterans Day. But it ends the fighting for a time until they can sign a peace treaty. This really kind of sends shockwaves throughout Germany. The people are not sure how to handle this defeat. They're caught by surprise, and there's a lot of anxiety. And the Kaiser wants to blame other people. So right before he signs this thing, he kind of ushers in this moderate government. That way his goal is to blame the moderates for this failure. That ends up backfiring on him, but it's kind of his strategy to deflect blame. And so what we see is there are some major changes in Austria as a result, and we'll kind of function through all the different changes in each of these countries. But Austria suffers major revolution like Germany, and they split into multiple states: Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Each of these places function as independent republics with voting and elections and these sorts of things. And so that's part of, and we'll get there when we talk about the Treaty of Versailles, but that's part of this idea of national self-determination, where these nationalist groups should be able to rule themselves and decide how that looks. And so those three kind of break off the Austrian Empire. And you recall those were the three biggest ethnic groups there: the Germans, the Hungarians, and then the Czechs. But those are independent republics. Serbia gains more land around them. They kind of annex some of that area that they had wanted for a long time. And they turn into Yugoslavia, which is a kingdom, not a republic. That's why it's not lumped together. So you kind of have those sorts of things happening in the East. In Germany, you have this massive frustration and disheartenment because of the loss of the war. People are really stung by this, in part because they had lost so many people in this war and gained nothing from it. I mean, we're talking millions of people who had died, been wounded, had their lives completely shattered, and that doesn't include the cost of the families back home. And because of this, there's a kind of a popular uprising that topples the government and the Kaiser. And what we see is this really starts to run on a parallel track to the Russian Revolution. Recall their frustration and dislike of the Tsar and his failures during the war. But Germany manages to right itself before it becomes that Marxist extremist. And that's for a few reasons right here. There's a moderate liberal government that's established, and they're able to stave off those radical elements in Germany for a number of reasons. And that's partly because Germans wanted true democracy and civil liberties. They had kind of had this era, you recall, under Bismarck and throughout their history as Prussia, where they were pushing for these, and at times they had them. It was certainly a more liberal and more advanced society than Russia. And because of that, there was larger pressure for those democracy and civil liberties. Also because it was a more educated society, people were in tune with what that actually meant, so they pushed for that. In Germany, there was also a real strong sense of nationalism and this real desire to avoid civil war and all the terror that came along with that. Being on the border with France, these Germans had seen the effects of civil war and the kind of disasters that came along with that, and the infighting and the death and destruction, and the inability to effectively run a government. So people are frustrated with that. And one of the other things that they do is that they end the war immediately, which means the soldiers no longer have anything to complain about. You recall during the Russian Revolution, the soldiers were kind of involved in the revolution because the war was still ongoing and they felt like they were dying for no apparent reason. In Germany, the war is immediately ended by this moderate government, and so the soldiers actually support the moderate government because they say, well, in a sense, you saved our lives. And so in that regard, they kind of support them. So there is revolution in Germany, and it does result in a change, in a definite change in types of government. But it's not as radical or as extreme as what we see in the Soviet Union. And so it's not as destructive. It doesn't result in this massive, overwhelmingly socialist communist state. So now let's get down to the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles is worth knowing. There are kind of major players who are at this signing of the treaty. And the big three, as they are known, are Woodrow Wilson from the United States, George Clemenceau from France, and Lloyd George from Great Britain. Vittorio Orlando is also there, and he's from Italy. He ends up getting really frustrated because he and the Italians don't get what they want. He is not considered a major player like the other three are. Germany and Austria-Hungary are not allowed to participate in the peace process. They are not invited to this. Russia, although they were one of the initial allies of France and Great Britain, is also not involved in this peace process, in part because they're in the middle of a civil war, but also because they had signed their own peace treaty with the Germans. So they're not involved. And there would have been kind of frustration, or I guess disagreement over who should be there from the Russians. Should it be someone from the government they liked or someone from the government that the West liked? Remember, they're in that civil war, whites versus reds. So these big three, Wilson, Clemenceau, and George, are really the ones making the decisions. Orlando is not super involved, and no other countries are really invited. One of the big things that is discussed that Woodrow Wilson really pushes at this conference is this idea of a League of Nations. He wanted to create an international organization whose task it was to prevent future wars. And this is really a shocking switcheroo from Wilson, who had been a previous isolationist in the United States, and he did not want to intervene at all. But now his whole thing was there needed to be some sort of international organization that would prevent future wars. And this was his main concern at the peace conference. And that was the main goal he had. His other two he was working with, George Clemenceau and Lloyd George, they didn't share that vision. They weren't as interested in this. They thought it was kind of idealistic and naive, coming from the United States, who was not muddled and involved in this politics on the continent. And France's big concern was that they felt it would only be a matter of time until Germany attacked them again. And because Germany was a nation of 60 million and France was a nation of 40 million, France did the numbers and realized that there was nothing that they would be able to do to stop that onslaught. Remember, the Germans had attacked them previously in the Franco-Prussian War. They had attacked them now during World War I, so they kind of see a pattern emerging here. France ends up signing a deal that guarantees an alliance with Britain and the United States, and that's their kind of acquiescence to this. But this main idea is this League of Nations pushed by Wilson, which ends up faltering and failing, but sets a precedent for the United Nations, which will come later, and even the European Union, this idea of multinational organizations working together to create prosperity. So, what does the Treaty of Versailles actually do? It does a few things, and it's worth noting that no one ends up being happy with the Treaty of Versailles. That's one of its biggest problems, is that everyone's frustrated with it on some level. So, first, it takes away major portions of German land. and distributes them to Poland. It recreates the idea of Poland, and it gives some back to France. They take the German colonies and they redistribute them to France, Britain, and Japan, but they label them League of Nations mandates. That is, the League of Nations would run them, and these governments would be on point for that until the countries were ready to have their independence. Now, it doesn't end up working out kind of in that way at all. And this is a major point of contention because the Italians are really frustrated that they don't get any colonies. Italy was not a major player in the scramble for Africa or the new imperialism that we see in the late 19th century, and so they feel like this is their opportunity to get involved in this colonization process, but they are left out of those colonies. And so they're really irritated with that. The German military is also restricted in terms of its size and type, so they're limited in the number of ships they can build and the types of them. Same with number of tanks and artillery and airplanes. And the idea is that they would keep the German military small so that it wouldn't threaten France. The big one that they do is that they force Germany to pay for reparations for all civilian damage done during the war. So houses destroyed, farms ravaged, anything like that, Germany is forced to pay reparations for. And that is a gigantic sum of money that they quite frankly are unable to pay off. And as we all know, that is one of the big things that leads to the collapse of the Weimar Republic in Germany and eventually to the rise of Nazi Germany and World War II. But that's in the future. And this is put in there at the request of France. They had been forced to pay reparations from the Franco-Prussian War, and now they felt it was time for payback to force the Germans to pay for reparations for World War I. The Americans and the British did not like this. A famous economist, John Keynes, walked away and said, "This is absurd. This will lead to ruin." And so this was really a France frustration with Germany that bubbles over and ends up in the League of Nations. It creates a demilitarized zone along the Rhineland that is between France and Germany. This was supposed to be a buffer zone that would protect France from any future German invasion, and of course Germany violates that later. It creates the League of Nations, although the United States never joins and it falls apart. The League of Nations is created for a while. It breaks up the Ottoman Empire and breaks up Hungary, and that's in part because Woodrow Wilson's push for national self-determination. He's saying that those large empires were ruling nationalities that they should not be, that each of those individual nationalities should have the right to rule themselves. It's interesting that Wilson does not apply that then to other colonies that were conquered by the European nations, but rather leaves that to Europe. It really shows kind of his, and really the worldwide racism at the time, where they believed that only white people could truly govern themselves. Other consequences is we have chaos in the Middle East, and that leads to today. There's lines that are redrawn. There's false promises made by Britain to their Arab allies at the time, and so it creates real issues. The Italians are frustrated. They don't get all the land they want, and they don't get the colonies, and so there's real resentment towards the Treaty of Versailles. From Italy as well as from Germany, because a lot of Italians think, well, why did we fight? We didn't really get what we thought we would get. What's going on with this? The British make something known as the Balfour Declaration, which has lasting consequences to this day. And in the Balfour Declaration, there's a British promise to create a national home for the Jewish people in the region of Palestine. And that ends up being what we know as the modern state of Israel. So, that's what we've got going on, and that leads to major consequences because the Palestinian Arabs don't want the Jewish homeland to be in their traditional homeland, but the British promise that that's where it will be, and so this international Zionist movement that had been started by Theodore Herzl continues to gain steam as they now have promises for a homeland. It's really abstract promises, and there's no definitive date set as to when that will be. But there is the promise that eventually you will get the your national homeland, and it will be in Palestine. So that's where we're at. And you see this is the chaos that's set up in the Middle East, where France is given reign over Lebanon and Syria. Britain gets Iraq, what they call Transjordan, and Palestine. They grant Saudi Arabia freedom because the Saudi Arabians had been kind of the major tribes that had fought for them during the war, but they really just redraw these lines, ignoring ethnic boundaries. So there's massive Kurdish population up here that gets ignored that should have their own state. There's different Shia and Sunni in these areas. And none of these countries are involved in the peace process. None of them are invited or even allowed to be there to help determine their future. So that's where Wilson's idea of self-determination falls short. And because of these randomly drawn lines breaking up what was the Ottoman Empire, it leads to chaos that exists to this day.